Jesus Christ, that's a bipedal, some kind of a bipedal humanoid.
Welcome to Bigfoot Encounters. Today's video, we examine the clearest Bigfoot sightings in the United States ever. From a divorced father who slowly realized that his kids had been meeting with Bigfoot, to a lone cyclist who gradually became aware that a Sasquatch is aggressively hunting him. Ray Dunlap has owned coonhounds his entire adult life. His best dog, a 7-year-old red and tan male named Copper, had never once refused a command. Not once in 7 years. Until the night Bigfoot came through Vinton County, Copper ran from something so completely that he chose a sealed, century-old railroad tunnel over the open dark of a county he knew by scent. Moonville Tunnel was cut through a sandstone ridge in the mid-1800s. It's sealed now and surrounded by deep forest. Ray had walked past it 100 times without a second thought. At 4 in the morning, Copper's GPS collar showed the dog sprinting northeast from near Route 56 at a full fleeing pace. Ray followed through the trees, calling the dog's name, getting nothing back. The signal stopped at the entrance of Moonville Tunnel. Ray found Copper pressed against the back wall, 40 yards in absolute darkness. Full body shudder, continuous. Copper's eyes fixed on the tunnel entrance. He wouldn't look at Ray, wouldn't move toward his voice. Ray had to carry him out, all 62 pounds, and Copper didn't stop shaking for 2 hours. At the tunnel entrance, just outside the threshold where sandstone meets the dirt path, Ray found a footprint. He measured it against his boot, and then again with the tape measure he keeps in his vest. 18 inches long, 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot. The impression depth in the soft soil put the weight at somewhere between 600 and 800 pounds by Ray's read. And Ray has been reading animal signs in Vinton County for decades. But the size wasn't what made him photograph it and text it to his cousin before he'd gotten Copper back to the truck. The toes were webbed, fully webbed, the way a beaver's hind foot is webbed, with the membrane pressing clear impressions in the mud between each digit. Ray has found bear tracks, deer, wild hog, river otter. He knows what belongs in that soil. He held his flashlight over that print and told me, nothing that lives in Ohio leaves a track like that. Then he noticed Copper's flank, a burn mark, circular, about the diameter of a $50, in the fur with none of the surrounding hair singed. Skin unbroken, no blood, a precise isolated thermal mark that has no fire, no branch, no friction explains. Webbed feet on something that weighs the better part of half a ton, a burn mark on a dog that fled, and The gate is already bent when the GoPro flicks on, the heavy steel crossbar pushed outward from the inside, bowing away from the road, like something enormous had pressed against it until the metal gave way. The cyclist barely slowed. The camera catches the gate in wide angle as he squeezes past the gap, and then he's through, and the logging road swallows him whole. The cyclist pumps hard up the first short rise, breathing loud over the wind noise, and for a moment everything is exactly what it looks like. A guy on a bike, a closed road, some poor lighting decision. Then the camera catches the tree line on the right. There is something standing in the trees. It is not a stump. Stumps don't have shoulders. The shape is massive, easily 7.5 feet tall, and it is standing perfectly still between 2 pine trunks about 60 feet off the road, partially screened by brush, watching. The cyclist doesn't see it, but the GoPro does. For 4 full seconds as the bike crests the rise, the shape is visible in the right edge of the frame. Dark, upright, wide across the chest, in a way that no deer or bear or trick of shadow can account for. Then the camera angle shifts as the road descends, and the shape is gone from frame. That is Bigfoot, and Bigfoot is already watching. The first mile of the road is wrong in a way that takes a moment to name. It's too quiet. The only sounds on the audio track are the cyclist's tires grinding gravel, his breathing, and the soft mechanical click of the drivetrain. Then the branches start snapping. The snapping comes from the right side of the trail, deep in the trees, and it comes in a rhythm, crack, pause, that matches the cadence of the bike exactly. When the cyclist accelerates, the snapping accelerates. When he coasts, it slows. He doesn't notice it at first. The camera picks it up before he does, because the audio is more honest than a person moving fast through darkening woods. For 30 seconds, 40 seconds, the bicycle and the forest keep the same beat. Something in those trees is pacing him. Bigfoot is not running. Bigfoot is not rushing. Bigfoot is walking, long and unhurried, keeping time with a man on a bicycle, the way a cat tracks a mouse across a room, not closing in, not falling back, just maintaining the exact distance it chooses to maintain. That detail is the most frightening thing on the footage so far. Not the size of the shape in the tree line, not the way it stood so perfectly still, the fact that it is matching his speed at a walk. The cyclist hears it finally. He pumps harder. The sound in the trees pumps harder too. He glances right, and for half a second, the camera catches a dark mass moving through the brush. Not a flash of fur, not a scramble. Movement that is controlled and deliberate, and too large to be anything the cyclist could name and stay comfortable about. He looks back at the road. He pedals harder. The snapping in the trees falls back into rhythm. There are trees snapped clean at chest height on the bend, not blown down, snapped the way you snap a pencil. The brakes fresh and pale and raw, sap still beating on the exposed wood. 6 of them in a rough line, all leaning the same direction, toward the road. Whatever moved through here was walking, and whatever it was tall enough that chest height for it is 7 feet off the ground, and strong enough that pine trunks 4 inches across gave way without drama. The cyclist stops pedaling for 3 seconds. The camera bobs as the bike slows, and in that brief hesitation, the tree line on the left side of the road opens up, a gap between 2 large firs, maybe 40 feet in, and Bigfoot is visible there, not hiding anymore, and it's walking. Bigfoot is moving left to right through the gap at a steady, upright pace, arms swinging, covering ground in strides so long they barely look like effort. The creature is in frame for less than a second, but the footage is clear enough. Bipedal, enormous, dark, and completely unbothered by the man on the road 20 feet away. It walks through the gap and the trees close behind it like a curtain falling. And then it's gone. The cyclist has seen it now. The camera catches his panic. The handlebars jerking left, then correcting, the front wheels skidding a half inch in the gravel, and he is pedaling again, hard, his breathing spiking on the audio, legs churning, but the road ahead narrows. The gravel turns uneven, chunks of loose stone and embedded rock jutting up through the packed surface, and the bike bucks and shimmies under him, slowing him even as he pushes harder. He can't hold speed on this surface. The road is fighting him. Behind him, through the gap in the trees he just passed, Bigfoot does not break into a run. The audio catches the first clear sound of it, a heavy, rhythmic impact on soft earth, the sound of something massive covering ground in long, controlled strides. It's walking faster, the strides lengthening until the time between impacts stretches and the sound deepens, each footfall hitting the ground like a thrown sandbag. The gap between each strike is enormous, a stride that must be 5 feet, maybe 6, and it is closing distance without raising its pace above a casual walk. The cyclist glances back. The camera follows the motion and catches the fog line 60 yards behind, a low ground fog rolling in off the hillside, soft and white, already thick enough to have visibility. At the edge of that fog, Bigfoot has moved to the tree line right alongside the road and is tracking parallel through the brush, not on the road surface, but in the narrow strip of undergrowth between the gravel shoulder and the forest proper. It is visible in the frame for 2, 3, 4 seconds, a dark vertical shape moving steadily through the gray-white fog, never quite stepping onto the road, never falling back into the trees. Just there, on the edge, matching every turn. The cyclist tries weaving. He cuts the bike hard left, then right, then left again, breaking his straight-line path and putting trees between himself and the shape in the fog. It's a reasonable instinct. It doesn't work. Bigfoot adapts inside a single stride. The shape in the trees vanishes from one gap and reappears at the next, having shifted its angle through the forest with a fluency that makes the cyclist's weaving look like it's being predicted rather than followed. The creature is moving through the forest on its own route, a route that runs parallel to the road, but intersects with it at every opening, every gap, every place where the tree line breaks for more than 2 feet. It is not following the cyclist's path, it is charting a better one. The cyclist cuts right toward the tree line, trying to break whatever line of sight Bigfoot is using. The camera catches branches whipping past the lens, a brief plunge into the shadow under the pines, and then the road again as he corrects. In that half second in the trees, there is a sound on the audio, a low, resonant exhale, close enough to distort the microphone slightly. Not a growl nor a scream, just breath, enormous and controlled, from something that was exactly where the cyclist rode. He gets back on the road and pedals faster than he has since the gate. It's do or die time. The road drops, not gradually, it tips over like a table edge and becomes steep, wet stone beneath the gravel, the surface slick with moisture that has seeped up through the roadbed from the hillside. The cyclist's tires lose grip on the first pedal stroke of the descent, and he stops pedaling entirely, feathering his brakes, the wheels skipping and chattering on the stone. He's going fast now without trying, the grade pushing him harder than his legs could, the bike shimmying under him as the tires hunt for traction. The camera swings back. Bigfoot is at the top of the slope. It is standing at the crest of the hill, fully visible against the darkening sky, and it is looking down the road, then moves, not down the road, into the trees on the left side, disappearing from view view at the top of the frame. The cyclist faces forward again, fighting the bike through a wet curve, rear wheel sliding 3 inches before biting. When the road straightens for a moment and the camera can see 50 yards ahead, Bigfoot is already there, halfway down the slope, emerging from the tree line on the right side of the road, having come down through the forest on a line that cut the switchback entirely. The hill that is slowing the cyclist down and threatening to throw him off his bike is, for Bigfoot, nothing. The creature used the terrain rather than fighting it, dropping through the forest on a direct line while the road curved and doubled back. This is not luck. This is not a shortcut stumbled onto. This is something that knows this hill, knows where the road goes, and is using that knowledge to get ahead of the man on the bicycle. The cyclist realizes it at the same moment the camera shows it. His breathing changes on the audio, not faster, but different. A sharp inhale and a held breath that signals the specific kind of fear that comes with understanding rather than surprise. He is being herded. The hill ends in a flat, and Bigfoot is already at the bottom, and there is nowhere to go but forward. The fog at the base of the hill is not the same as the ground fog from before. This is a wall, white and dense and vertical, dropping visibility to 10 feet, maybe less. The cyclist hits it at speed, and the camera turns white. Everything disappears. The road, the tree line, the sky, all of it replaced by a flat, featureless white that the GoPro's exposure system can't parse. For 2 full seconds, there is nothing but fog and the sound of tires on gravel and the cyclist's breathing. Then Bigfoot is in the fog with him. The shape appears in the white, not a silhouette against brightness, but a darker density within the fog itself, a place where the whiteness is thicker and darker at the same time, moving without sound. It is 10 feet to the left, then 12 feet ahead. Then the fog shifts, and it is just a shapeless mass of dark moving through the white, its outline breaking apart and reforming with each gust that stirs the fog layer. No footsteps. The ground here is soft, wet pine duff soaked through with moisture, and Bigfoot's footfalls make no sound that carries over the cycling noise. The cyclist brakes. The tires lock and slide, and the bike goes sideways, and the camera tilts hard to the right before he catches it. He puts a foot down and stops, standing astride the bike in the fog, and the audio goes very quiet. Just his breathing, just the distant sound of water somewhere on the hillside. And then, very close, 8 feet, maybe less, a sound that is not wind and not water and not any animal sound the microphone has captured yet. A sound like air being displaced by something large and slow. The soft percussion of movement, too controlled to be accidental and too close to be safe. Bigfoot is right there. The cyclist doesn't wait for a visual. He drops the bike. The audio catches the clatter of aluminum on gravel, and he runs. The camera shakes so badly for the next 40 seconds that individual frames are nearly unusable, but the audio is continuous, and the blur of motion is consistent. He is in the trees. Branches snap across the lens, a bright flare as a thin branch catches the light, then shadow, then another branch. His footsteps on the forest floor are soft, wet needles, soft soil, and his breathing is ragged now, not the controlled effort of a hard climb, but the open-mouthed gasp of someone running as hard as their legs will carry them through darkness. Behind him, Bigfoot is in the trees too. The sound of it is not frantic. That is the part that the audio captures most clearly in the moments when the cyclist slows enough that his own footsteps stop masking the world around him. There is no crashing, no blind thrashing through undergrowth. There is the sound of large things bending, branches and saplings flexing under pressure and snapping back, but it is a rhythmic, controlled sound. Bigfoot is moving through the forest the way water moves through a landscape, not fighting the terrain, using it, taking the path of least resistance that also happens to be faster than the path the cyclist is on. The cyclist cuts right. Bigfoot is already there. A sound of heavy impact on the ground somewhere to the right that is close enough to redirect him without a visual. He cuts left. The same thing happens. Bigfoot is cutting angles, staying in front of each direction. The cyclist chooses the moment he chooses it, appearing on the right when he goes right, on the left when he goes left, as if it can see where the turn will end before the turn begins. The net effect is that the cyclist keeps moving in the same direction, pushed forward by the sound of something he cannot outmaneuver. The forest floor drops away and the camera catches a streak of dim sky, a ravine 5 feet across, spanned by a fallen log, maybe a foot in diameter. The log is old bark sloughing off in strips, pale and damp in the last gray light. The cyclist hits it running and doesn't stop, jumping onto the log and running across it with his arms out, balancing by instinct over the 7-foot drop to dry stone below. He is halfway across when he sees Bigfoot on the other side. Bigfoot is standing at the far end of the log, on the bank above the ravine. and it got there faster than a man running flat out through open ground. The camera catches it clearly for the first time, without fog or motion blur, fully upright, arms at its sides, watching the man on the log with something that the footage cannot interpret as anything other than patience. Just waiting, the way something waits when it knows it has already won the geometry of the situation. Then Bigfoot steps onto the log, 1 foot first, slow, the whole weight coming down deliberately, and the log flexes. The cyclist feels it. The camera bobs as the vibration travels, and he runs. There is nowhere to run except forward, past Bigfoot, but Bigfoot steps aside just enough. 1 step left, opening the bank, and the cyclist hits the far side and scrambles up the bank, clawing at roots, pulling himself over the edge with both hands. Behind him, the audio catches the log creaking under a load the cyclist's weight was nowhere near producing. Bigfoot crosses the ravine in 3 strides, balanced with no adjustment, no hesitation, the way you walk a floor you have walked 1,000 times. The cyclist runs uphill. The embankment ahead is steep, 40 degrees maybe, exposed root systems poking out of the bare soil where rain has eaten the slope. The cyclist uses them like ladder rungs, grabbing and pulling, climbing hand over hand, while his feet scramble for purchase on the wet earth. It's slow going. It is, for a human, as fast as it gets. Bigfoot does not climb the same way. The camera catches it from below and behind as the cyclist crests the embankment, 2 massive hands driving into the earth, fingers splaying and gripping, and then a pull that lifts the entire body in a single lurch. Bigfoot is not climbing the slope so much as refusing to be stopped by it, driving itself upward by the sheer application of strength against dirt. The cyclist reaches the top and rolls over the edge onto flat ground, and Bigfoot is already there. It's standing on flat ground, having come up a different face of the hill, a faster route through the forest that the camera never captured because it was behind the cyclist, and now it is in front of him again, 10 feet away on the edge of the ridge, outlined against the sky. The cyclist turns and runs along the ridge. The conservation fence appears out of nowhere, a 6-foot chain-link fence, old, the posts rusted orange, running perpendicular to his path and cutting off the ridge. The cyclist hits it at speed and doesn't slow, one hand grabbing the chain link and his feet finding the mesh, and he is over the top in 5 seconds, landing hard on the far side and staggering but staying upright. He does not hear Bigfoot hit the fence. Instead, he hears the fence coming down, a single sharp metallic shriek as a steel post pulls out of the ground, the chain link buckling in a wave, and then the sound of a section of fence folding flat. The camera catches it over his shoulder as he runs, Bigfoot stepping through a 6-foot gap in the chain link where 2 posts have simply given way. The mesh hanging in folds, the creature not slowing, not acknowledging the fence as an obstacle any more than a man acknowledges a wet paper bag on the floor. He runs along the fence line, using it as a wall on his right. The logic is simple. The fence is a barrier, and if Bigfoot is on the other side, the fence buys distant. The camera tracks the fence post ticking past, regular as a metronome, and for 50 yards, the only sound is his footsteps and his breathing, and the distant creak of settling metal behind him. Then, the fence starts moving. On the other side of the chain link, Bigfoot is using the fence the way the cyclist is, as a guide, a straight line to follow, a landmark in the dark forest. Bigfoot's shadow is visible through the mesh in the places where the tree cover breaks enough to let in the last gray skylight, moving parallel, matching stride for stride. The fence that was supposed to be a barrier is now a channel, and Bigfoot is on one side, and the cyclist is on the other, and they are running the same line. He leaves the fence and dives into the darkness of the forest. The drainage channel is concrete, a rectangular culvert about 4 feet wide and 5 feet deep, built to carry runoff down the hillside, bone dry in the late summer, but smelling of wet stone and rot. The cyclist drops into it feet first, the camera catching the gray walls rising around him, and starts running. It is, in the moment, logical, a concrete channel with no loose footing, no branches, no obstacles, the fastest path he has found since leaving the road. The footsteps behind him arrive in the channel and become something else entirely. Concrete channels are echo chambers. Each of Bigfoot's footfalls, that heavy, deliberate impact, that sandbag on earth sound, bounces off the walls and doubles back and then doubles back again, so that the sound of one pursuing creature fills the channel the way thunder fills a narrow valley. The audio on the footage clips, the microphone can't handle it, and the cyclist's own footsteps are completely buried under the reverberating weight of what is behind him. The channel walls are rising on both sides, the concrete damp and gray, and the sky above is a narrow strip dark purple, barely visible at the top of the channel's open sides. The channel fork, a Y junction, the main channel continuing straight and a narrower branch cutting left maybe 2 feet wide. The cyclist takes the narrow branch without slowing, turning left and scraping his shoulder on the junction corner, the camera catching a brief flash of concrete rushing past too close. And then he is in the narrow channel, arms brushing both walls. Bigfoot takes neither branch. The audio catches the grunt first, low, chest deep, the sound of massive effort, and then the camera catches the junction behind him. Bigfoot has vaulted over the concrete divider wall rather than choosing either channel, landing ahead of the fork on the far side, blocking the main channel and forcing the narrow branch. The creature landed in exactly the place that eliminates the most options. The narrow channel spits him out onto a gravel slope, and the cyclist scrambles up it, clawing at the rock, and emerges back onto what was once a road, narrower than the logging road, barely a track, running along the edge of a cliff face with nothing on the right but a 70-foot drop and scrub pine below. His bike is there. Somehow, through the weaving and the trees and the channel and the ravine, the bicycle has ended up here, lying on its side in the gravel. The GoPro's twin obviously mounted to the handlebars, still running and capturing a different angle on the same scene. The cyclist's feet, the gravel, and behind him, emerging from the channel, the lower half of something enormous. He grabs the bike without stopping. He is on it and moving in 3 seconds. The cliff road is the fastest surface since the logging road, the gravel packed and even, and the cyclist uses every inch of it, driving hard into the pedals and letting the bike accelerate below him. The camera angle from the handlebar mount catches the road rushing past in a blur of gray, the cliff face close on the left, the drop close on the right, and the audio fills with wind noise and tire roar. On the slope below the cliff road, through the scrub pine and loose rock, Bigfoot is keeping pace. Not on the road, below it, on terrain that should make pace impossible. Loose shale, 40-degree incline, scrub brush thick enough that a person would have to fight through it. Bigfoot is not fighting through it. Branches explode outward as the creature hits them, not bending, not parting, but snapping and scattering, and the sound carries up to the road and bursts like something hitting a chain-link fence with a bat. The slope is trying to pull the creature down, and the creature is ignoring the slope, moving across it at road speed through pure physics-defying insistence. The cyclist's speed no longer matters. That is the information the cliff road is delivering. Whatever speed the bicycle can achieve on this surface, Bigfoot matches it from terrain, where matching that speed should be impossible. It is not a question of who is faster. It is a question of who owns the terrain, and the terrain belongs to something that treats loose shale on a 40-degree slope as a minor inconvenience. He reaches for his brakes as the road narrows, too narrow to ride. The path ahead squeezes to 2 feet wide, the cliff face brushing the handlebars on the left, and he has to slow and pick his way through, the bike wobbling, his knees brushing stone. Below him, through a gap in the scrub, Bigfoot is visible for 1 clear second, directly below, looking up, its face turned toward the cyclist on the cliff road 30 feet above with an expression the camera cannot read and does not need to. Then the scrub closes over it and the sound of branches continues below, moving forward. He triggers the rocks accidentally. His front wheel clips a loose section of the road edge and a cascade of stone goes over the side. A dozen rocks, some of them the size of his head, bouncing down the cliff face in a clatter of impact, each one louder than the last as they accelerate. A logical next action. More rock, on purpose, pushed over the edge with his foot. 3, 4, 5. A small rock slide dropping into the scrub below where the sounds of movement are loudest. The rock slide sounds like something large breaking. The scrub rustles violently as debris impacts it. The movement sounds below stop for exactly 1 second. Then they continue. Bigfoot emerges from the bottom of the rockfall zone, still moving forward, still at pace, the debris having done nothing measurable. The sound of its movement is unchanged. The only difference is that a few seconds have passed. The cliff road ends and the forest opens into a straight corridor. 2 rows of dense fir trees, old growth, their trunks 2 feet across, spaced close enough that only the corridor between them is navigable. It runs straight for maybe 150 yards. At the end of it, the trees thin and there is a shape against the lighter dark of an open sky. A building, a road, something that means other people. The cyclist sees it and accelerates accelerate. Everything left in his legs, everything left in his lungs, going into the 150 yards between him and the end of the corridor. Bigfoot steps out of the trees at the far end of the corridor before the cyclist is halfway down it, not charging, just there. Standing in the corridor's exit, filling it with its width, looking down the 75 yards of open space at the man sprinting toward it. Then it moves, not to close the distance, but sideways, one step back into the trees, not blocking the exit anymore, just present at the edge of it, like the chase is not over, like the chase is still being offered to continue. The cyclist doesn't slow down. He makes the choice in a half second and goes for the corridor exit straight at where Bigfoot just was, banking on the gap. The camera catches the tree trunks flashing past, the exit rushing up the dark edge where the corridor opens, and he is through, and the building is ahead, and he is still running. There is a concrete culvert under the road, not a large one, a drainage pipe, maybe 3 feet in diameter, the opening dark and low, running under the road grade at road level. He sees it, and he goes for it the way drowning people go for anything they can reach. He goes in head first. The camera stabilizes for the first time in 40 minutes. The culvert is round, concrete, cold. The cyclist has pushed himself in up to his hips, his upper body and the GoPro inside the pipe, and the world in the footage is reduced to a circle of concrete tube with a dim ring of sky visible at the far end, maybe 20 yards away. His breathing fills the pipe, bouncing off the walls, and his heartbeat is audible on the audio as a rhythmic distortion in the microphone. Nothing is moving for 3 seconds, 4 seconds, the footage is still, and the audio is just breath and pulse. Then Bigfoot arrives at the entrance. The circle of dark sky at the entrance shrinks. Bigfoot is crouching at the opening, and the shape of it fills the frame. Shoulders wider than the culvert opening, the creature having to duck its head and angle sideways just to bring its face to the entrance. The darkness from outside flows into the pipe, and the footage goes to near black, the GoPro adjusting desperately for the new light level. What the camera can see, a mass of dark, details lost in the adjustment. Bigfoot is not trying to fit through the pipe. The pipe is too narrow by a foot on each side. The creature knows this. It is crouching at the entrance the way you crouch at a mouse hole, not trying to go in, knowing it doesn't need to. One arm enters the culvert. It comes in slowly, not a grab, an extension, the arm moving forward at a pace that has nothing urgent about it, nothing frantic. The hand is enormous, the fingers spread slightly, and it is dark enough that the camera only catches it in detail when the knuckles brush the concrete sides of the pipe. Left side, a soft scrape of contact, and the arm adjusts, centering itself. It is not reaching blindly. It is placing itself deliberately, moving forward with the patience of something that knows exactly what is at the end of the pipe and is in no hurry because hurry is not necessary. The cyclist screams. It is the first sound he has made that isn't breathing or the wordless grunting of physical effort. It echoes in the culvert like a gunshot in a bathroom, doubling and tripling off the concrete, and the hand pauses for exactly 1 second and then continues forward. The screaming stops. There is a sudden, violent shift in the camera angle, not a gradual motion, but an instantaneous jerk, the footage lurching from the interior of the pipe to a spinning view of concrete rushing past, and then open air, and then gravel. The sound on the audio is a single heavy impact and then nothing. The last image the GoPro captures is from where it has landed, on its side in the gravel above the culvert entrance. The road is empty. The culvert entrance is empty. The bicycle is lying on its side 20 feet away. The forest holds its silence. The footage ends. Marcus Tilley has been driving long-haul routes through southern Ohio for 11 years. He has logged more than 1 million miles on these roads. He knows the difference between a deer at the shoulder and a shape in the dark that isn't one. He was doing a routine overnight run on Route 56 when it happened, 3:14 in the morning. No other traffic. The road ahead was empty and straight, and then it wasn't. Something stepped out of the tree line and onto the asphalt. Marcus had maybe 3 seconds. He yanked the wheel hard to the right, hard enough that the trailer fishtailed, tires screaming across the center line. And when he looked back through the windshield, the thing he'd swerved around was still moving, crossing the road, not running, not startled, not doing anything that suggested it had registered a 40,000-pound truck as a threat worth reacting to. It moved in a long, fluid stride, unhurried, weightless, impossibly smooth for something that Marcus estimated at 9 feet tall. He's a big man himself, 6'2", and he told me the proportion of what he saw to the road width he's driven 1,000 times was something he couldn't unfold in his head for days afterward. It was too large, not just larger than a person, larger in a way that made the road look like a different road, like something had rescaled it. He pulled to the shoulder, hazard lights strobing red across the tree line. He sat with the engine running for 4 minutes. He checked his phone twice before he got out. He walked to the center of the road and stopped. The asphalt was rippling, not cracked, not buckled, rippling, the way blacktop looks on a July highway in triple-digit heat. He pressed his palm flat against the surface. The road was warm enough that he pulled his hand back. The outside temperature that night was 39 degrees. The asphalt beneath where it had crossed was radiating heat like a cast iron skillet off a stove. That's not a footprint, that's a thermal event. His dash cam covers the 12 seconds before and after. What it captured was not footage of Bigfoot. It was 12 seconds of white static and a low-frequency hum. When the image returned, the road was empty. My name is Jesse Stroud. I moved onto this property in September 2015 because I wanted land of my own, quiet mornings, and nobody telling me what to do with my weekends. I got all of that. What I did not get was any kind of warning about what was already living here before I showed up with my lumber and my big plans. The clearing crew finished on a Thursday. By Sunday morning, something had gone through the eastern edge of my property and snapped 3 trees at about 8 feet off the ground. Not knocked over, not uprooted, snapped, like someone had grabbed them and just broken them the way you'd break a pencil. I walked out there with my coffee and stood looking at it for a good 5 minutes, trying to work out what could have done that. My first thought was wind. My second thought was that I have lived through plenty of wind, and wind has never once snapped a tree at a consistent 8 feet like it was trying to make a point. My third thought was that maybe I should have bought that condo instead. I told myself it was probably the clearing equipment. Maybe one of the crew had clipped them on the way out, and I just hadn't noticed. I went back inside and finished my coffee and felt pretty good about that explanation for about 2 days. Then I found the footprint. It was in the mud at the creek edge on the eastern boundary, 14 inches long, 5 toes, pressed so deep into the ground that whatever made it had to be carrying serious weight on that foot. I put my own boot next to it, and my boot looked like a child's shoe. I stood there staring at it, and then I looked up at the tree line, and there was not a single bird calling, not a single branch moving, nothing rustling in the undergrowth, just total dead silence on a morning that had been plenty noisy 5 minutes before I got there. I went home and sat at my kitchen table, and I want you to know that I am a practical man who does not panic. So naturally, I ordered 6 trail cameras, 2 motion sensors, and an audio recorder, and had them shipped overnight. I had the cameras up by Wednesday, 6 of them spread across the eastern boundary, covering every angle I could manage, strapped to trees, motion activated, night vision on all of them. I have set up trail cameras more times than I can count for deer season, and I can usually get through the whole process without thinking too hard about it. This time, I kept stopping, not because the setup was difficult, but because the woods were doing that thing again, where everything goes quiet the moment you pay attention to it. No birds, no squirrels, nothing moving in the undergrowth. Just me out there screwing mounts into bark and trying not to feel like I was being watched while I set up equipment specifically to catch whatever was watching me. I finished around noon, walked back to the house, and told myself that whatever showed up on those cards was going to have a perfectly reasonable explanation. A bear maybe, an unusually large one. I was going to pull that footage in a week and feel a little embarrassed about the overnight shipping charge. That is not what happened. I pulled the first card after 6 days. I sat down at my kitchen table the same way I always do, coffee on the left, laptop open, ready to scroll through a week of deer and raccoons and maybe a coyote if I was lucky. The first 3 nights were normal. Deer moving through at dusk, a possum at around 11, the usual. I was actually starting to feel good about myself and my very reasonable bear theory. Then I got to Thursday night at 2 a.m. and I stopped scrolling. It was upright. It was massive, moving through the eastern edge of the cleared zone at a pace that was slow and deliberate in a way that made my stomach do something unpleasant. I rewound it and watched it again. Then I watched it a third time, leaning close enough to the screen that I could see my own reflection in it. I have been hunting my whole adult life, and I know what every animal looks like on a trail camera at 2 in the morning. I know what a bear looks like when it stands up. I know what a tall man in dark clothing looks like. I know what shadows do at the edge of an infrared field, and this was none of those things. I sat back in my chair and looked at my coffee going cold on the left side of the table, and I said it out loud even though there was nobody in that kitchen to hear it. Bigfoot, not as a question and not as a joke either. Just the word sitting there in the air because it was the only one that fit what I was looking at, and I am too old to spend energy pretending otherwise. I called my brother that same night and told him what was on the footage. He asked me to send him the clip. I sent it. He called back 10 minutes later and told me it was a bear and that I needed to get out of the house more. I thanked him for his input and hung up. And then maybe 4 days after I pulled that first card, I was out at dusk checking the cameras and topping up the batteries on the 2 eastern ones. The light was going flat the way it does in late October, that gray hour where everything loses its edges and the tree line just becomes one long dark wall. I was about halfway through swapping the battery on the second camera when I heard the undergrowth shift. It was not the sound of a small animal or a branch settling. It was the sound of something with serious weight behind it, adjusting its position the way a large animal sounds when it has been standing still for a while and decides to move. I stopped what I was doing and looked up. It was standing at the edge of the trees about 50 feet away from me. I know what you are probably picturing, and that is not what this was. It was not lunging at me, and it was not screaming. It was just standing there in the gray light, looking directly at me, the way you look at someone who has walked into a room they were not invited into. That was exactly what it felt like too, standing there, holding a trail camera battery in my hand, like an idiot, like I had walked into a room that belonged to someone else and gotten caught. Neither of us moved for close to a full minute. I counted because I needed something to do with my brain that was not panicking. Then it stepped back into the trees and was gone, and I stood there in the gray light alone and noticed that my legs had started shaking at some point during that minute without asking my permission. I went inside that night and pulled up the footage from all 6 cameras covering the eastern boundary. I was looking for a better angle of what I had just seen, something that gave me more detail than my own 2 eyes had managed in that gray light, and I did find it on camera 3. There it was, same figure, same tree line, pretty much exactly what I remembered. But then I checked camera 5, which covers the area behind and to the left of where I had been standing, and I watched it once, and then I watched it again, because my brain was genuinely refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. While I had been standing there staring at the one at the tree line, a second one had come out of the woods on the left side of the property and closed to within 60 feet of me from behind. 60 feet away, and I never heard it coming, never felt anything behind me, never had a single instinct fire that told me something that large was standing that close to the back of my head. It just stood there the whole time I was having my little staring contest with the first one. And then, when the first one stepped back into the trees, the second one turned around and walked back into the woods like it had somewhere else to be. I sat with that footage for a long time that night, because here is what that means. 2 of them, that close, and nothing happened. Which sounds like good news until you really think about it. Something that size deciding not to act is not the same as something that size being unable to act. That was a choice. And whatever the reason behind that choice was, I was fairly certain it had nothing to do with being afraid of me. After the footage from that night, I stopped thinking about this as a trail camera project and started thinking about it as something I needed to actually understand. So I spent a few days doing something I probably should have done before I ever signed the deed on this property, which was looking into the land itself. I pulled the survey maps and walked the property with them, tracing exactly where the clearing crew had worked against what I was finding on the ground. And when I laid those 2 things on top of each other, the picture that came together was not one I felt great about. The stand of trees I had taken down was not sitting in a random patch of forest. It was sitting directly on a natural corridor that ran along the eastern boundary, following the creek line, moving through a gap between 2 ridges to the north. A route that anything large moving through this part of the country would use, because the terrain funneled you there, whether you were a deer or a bear, or apparently something considerably larger than either. I had not cleared a patch of trees. I had taken out a section of a road, one that had been in use for a long time by something that did not appreciate the renovation. I drove out to the cleared zone that evening and stood at the stumps of the trees I had taken down and looked at what I had done to that corridor, and I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it surprised me. It was not fear, and it was not defensiveness. It was guilt, plain and simple guilt, the same feeling you get when you break something that belonged to someone else. And I remember standing there thinking, did I even check what was out here before I let those guys start the chainsaws? Did I even ask? The answer was no. I had not asked because it had not occurred to me that there was anyone to ask. I went down to the creek bed the following morning with a flashlight and a measuring tape. I was thinking maybe some older prints, a few seasons worth of activity, enough to confirm that the corridor had been in regular use. I went down there looking for a few old prints, and what I found instead made me stand in that creek for 10 minutes, just staring at the ground like I had never seen mud before. The prints were layered, pressed into the dried mud and stone at different depths, different ages, some of them recent enough that the edges were still sharp, and some of them so old they had basically become part of the rock itself. The same stride, the same size, the same route, over and over again, going back further than I could put a number on. I am not a geologist, and I cannot tell you exactly how old the deepest ones were. What I can tell you is that the tree stumps I was feeling guilty about the night before were saplings the last time something had not been walking through this creek bed. So how long had this been going on? How many years was something using this corridor before a single human being had any claim to this land at all? I did not have an answer for that standing in that creek bed, and I still do not have one now. What I had was a measuring tape, a flashlight, and the slowly settling realization that whatever I had disturbed when I started my clearing crew was not a recent arrival that had wandered onto my property. It had been here so much longer than me that the word trespasser did not apply to either one of us. And it definitely did not apply to the one leaving 14-inch prints in the rock. This was November 2015. I was out fixing the eastern fence line on a Saturday afternoon. Nothing dramatic, just replacing a section that had come loose over the winter before I moved in. It was maybe 3 in the afternoon, good light, nothing about the day that suggested I should be anywhere other than where I was. The wood knocks started about 20 minutes into the job. 3 of them from somewhere deep in the tree line, each one louder than the one before it. I had never heard wood knocking before in person, and I remember my first thought was that someone was doing construction work somewhere on the other side of the tree line. That thought lasted about 4 seconds, because the second knock was closer than the first, and the third one was closer still, and whatever was making that sound was not on the other side of anything. It was moving toward me through the trees, and it was not trying to be quiet about it. Then the tree line erupted. That is the only word I have for it. Something moved through the trees parallel to where I was standing, and it covered the full length of my fence line in maybe 8 seconds. I could hear branches the size of my forearm snapping clean off as it went. I could feel the footfalls coming up through the ground into the soles of my boots. It never came out of the trees, and it never showed itself, but it did not need to because the message was loud enough without a visual aid. I had been out here long enough, and I needed to wrap that up now. I put my tools down slowly, picked up my truck keys, and walked back to the house. I did not run, not because I was calm. I was not calm, but because somewhere in the back of my head, I had the very strong feeling that running was exactly the wrong thing to do. I showed the footage to a buddy from work the following week. 3 months of clips, the territorial markers, the whole thing laid out in order. He watched it for about 10 minutes and then told me I should look into getting a game warden out there. I asked him if he had actually watched what I just showed him. He said he had, and that it was probably a bear. I stopped showing people the footage after that, for a while anyway. I did not sleep well that November, so I spent a lot of nights at my kitchen table going down research holes. The thing that stopped me first was the Sierra Sounds, recordings made in the California wilderness in the 1970s of vocalizations that a retired Navy cryptolinguist named R. Scott Nelson formally analyzed and concluded showed the structural characteristics of a real language. Not human, not any known animal. I put my headphones on and listened to it alone in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, and I am not going to pretend that was a comfortable experience. Then I found something called infrasound, and everything I had felt in October suddenly had a name. It is sound at frequencies below what human ears can consciously hear, and the effect on people nearby is a feeling of dread with no obvious source. I read that and went completely still, because that was exactly what I had felt during the first encounter. That pressure in my chest that I could not explain. It had been communicating with me since October, and I had not even known there was a message being sent. I did a full walk of the property boundary one morning and started noticing things I had either missed before or that had not been there before. I am still not sure which. Specific trees along the eastern boundary had their bark stripped in deliberate patterns at a consistent height, around 8 feet up, the same height as the snapped trees from September. Large rocks that had no business being that far from the creek had been repositioned along the edge of the cleared zone, placed at intervals that were too consistent to be accidental. And the section of fence line I had been repairing when the wood knocks started had been pulled apart again, not broken, pulled, the posts worked loose from the ground and moved aside at the exact point where the fence crossed the corridor route. I walked the full boundary and took photographs of everything, and when I got back to the house and looked through them all together, the message was pretty clear. This is where your land ends. This is where ours begins. The fact that my deed said otherwise was apparently not a compelling argument. After finding those markers, I wanted to know how far the corridor actually extended beyond my property. So I spent a few days walking the creek line in both directions past my boundary. I talked to two neighbors whose land bordered mine on the north and south ends and asked them casually if they had noticed anything unusual in the woods. One of them looked at me for a long moment before he said anything, and then just told me he did not go past the creek anymore and changed the subject. The other one had not been on his back acreage in over a year, and when I asked why, he said the dogs refused to go back there. I kept walking the creek line on my own after that. The corridor did not start at my property, and it did not end there either. It ran continuously in both directions as far as I followed it. Same signs, same stripped bark at the same height, same repositioned rocks marking the edges. My fence, my survey markers, my property lines meant absolutely nothing to whatever was using this route. Those boundaries were a human idea, and this thing had been here long before humans in this county had started drawing lines on maps and arguing about who owned what. I remember standing at my northern property marker, this little orange stake in the ground that I had paid a surveyor $400 to put there, and thinking that it was probably the most meaningless $400 I had ever spent. I found the first one on a Monday morning in December 2015, a full-grown deer at the edge of the cleared zone, right where the corridor met the boundary I had disturbed. It had not been killed there. The ground around it was not disturbed enough for that, and there was barely any predation damage on it. It had been carried there and set down in that specific spot, deliberately, and I already knew by December what was large enough and strong enough to do that on my property. What I did not know was why. 2 weeks later, there was a second one at the same spot, same careful placement, same minimal damage, and this time beside it, pressed into the soft ground, was a handprint, 4 fingers and a thumb, the palm roughly twice the width of mine. I put my own hand next to it and looked at the size difference for a while. Something that leaves a print that size had just carried a full-grown deer across my property and placed it at the edge of my cleared zone like it was making a point. And I think that is exactly what it was doing. It was not a gift, and it was not a coincidence. It was a demonstration. It was showing me what it was capable of carrying, how close it had been to my property line, and how little my cleared zone meant as a boundary to something that size. Up until January 2016, everything had been happening at the tree line. The encounters, the markers, the carcasses, all of it out there at the eastern boundary. That changed on a Wednesday night in January. I woke up at 2 a.m. to my dogs standing frozen in the middle of the bedroom, hackles up, staring at the back wall. Then I felt it, a pressure transferring through the exterior of the house, moving slowly from one end of the back wall to the other, like something running its hand along the outside of my house in the dark. I got my rifle and sat in the corner chair until sunrise. The porch cameras caught the bottom 20 inches of it, passing each lens as it made one full circle around the house and walked back toward the tree line. I watched that footage in the morning and understood that everything before this had been a warning. This was something else entirely. I drove to my neighbor's property that same morning, the one who had told me early on that he did not go past the creek anymore. I showed him the porch camera footage on my phone and watched his face while he watched it. He handed my phone back and told me he did not want to be involved. That was the last time I tried to tell anyone about what was happening on this property. After the night it circled the house, I started looking into who had owned this property before me. It took me about a week to track down the man who had sold it, an older farmer who had moved 3 counties away and did not have much of an online presence. I found a phone number through the county records, and I called him on a Tuesday afternoon. He picked up on the 3rd ring. When I told him why I was calling, he was quiet for a long time before he said anything. Long enough that I checked my phone to see if the call had dropped. Then he started talking, and he did not stop for almost an hour. He had experienced everything I had experienced, and then some. The footage, the wood knocks, the territorial markers, the carcasses. It had come to his house too, and he told me that when it did, it had not stopped at the wall the way it had with me. He would not go into detail about what happened after that. What he did say was that he had his family packed and out of that house in under a week, and that he had not driven past the county line since. Before he hung up, he said one thing that I have thought about every day since. He said he was sorry he had not left a note. After that phone call, I went back into the county records and started looking at the ownership history of this specific parcel of land. What I found was a pattern that was hard to look at once I saw it. Nobody stayed long. The tenures were short, some of them less than a year, and they went back further than I expected. Every few years, the land changed hands quietly, with no real explanation in any document I could find. I managed to track down 2 other previous owners besides the farmer. One was a woman who simply said she did not want to talk about it and hung up. The other was a man who stayed on the phone long enough to tell me that whatever I was dealing with out there had been going on for as long as anyone in that county could remember, and that the smart move was to sell while I still felt like it was my idea. Every encounter up to this point had been at dusk or in the dark. That changed on a Saturday morning in February 2016. I was in my backyard drinking coffee and looking at a section of roof that needed attention when I looked up and it was standing at the edge of the yard 40 feet away in full daylight. This was the first time I had seen it clearly, not through a camera lens, not in failing light. 40 feet away in the middle of a Saturday morning, and I could see everything, the full height of it, somewhere around 8 feet, the width of the shoulders, the way it held itself with a stillness that felt more like patience than anything else. It looked at me, then it turned its head slowly toward the house, then back to me. It did this twice, and then it just stood there and waited. I understood what it was saying without needing it explained. After everything since September 2015, the message was clear enough. Make a decision. Because as far as it was concerned, I was the problem, and the problem was still standing in its yard drinking coffee. I am not going to pretend the daylight encounter did not get to me, because it did. That night, I packed a bag, put it by the door, and sat in my truck in the driveway at 4 a.m. with the engine running. I had built this house with my own hands and put everything I had into this land, and I sat there in the dark, running the numbers on whether any of that was still worth what was happening. I thought about what the previous owner had said on the phone, that the people who left did not stop being afraid. They just moved their fears somewhere smaller. I sat with that for a while. Then I turned the engine off, went back inside, and put the bag in the closet. I decided I was not leaving, so I stood there and I took it, 2 of them screaming from the dark on either side of me, and then I took 1 step back, then another. I kept my eyes on the tree line and kept stepping back slowly, 1 foot at a time, all the way across the property until I hit the porch steps. I went inside and locked the door and went straight to the window that faces the eastern tree line. I stood there in the dark of my own living room looking out at the woods for a long time. I could not see anything, but the screaming had stopped the moment I reached the porch, and that told me enough about how closely it had been watching me walk back. It was just standing there 20 feet away watching me, and it was holding something at its side, a dead animal hanging from one hand while it stood completely still and watched me the entire time, just holding it there like it was the most normal thing in the world. And the screaming from the tree line, the thing I had spent the whole night focused on, that had just been the thing it wanted me looking at, while this one walked out of the woods and stood 20 feet away with a bloody carcass in its hand. That is not random behavior. Every encounter had been a step, and every interaction had been a question. Does he run? Does he panic? Does he stop coming out here? And the answer every single time had been no. I had stood my ground through the wood knocks and the carcasses and the house and the screaming, and I had done it without fully understanding that standing my ground was exactly what was being measured. It had spent 7 months deciding whether I was worth tolerating on this land. The final encounter answered that question in a way I was not expecting. Late March 2016. I was standing at the edge of the cleared zone at dusk when I heard it coming through the tree line before I saw it. Branches snapping, ground shaking, and then it walked out and stopped 10 feet away from me. 10 feet. I have been scared before in these woods. Not like that. I could hear it breathing. My rifle was back at the house, and I already knew that was a problem. Then the infrasound hit harder than it ever had before. It went through my chest, my legs, my hands. Everything in me said run, and I could not move. And then it opened its mouth. It built in my chest before I heard it with my ears, and when it finally came out, it was one word, rough and wrong, but clear enough that there was no question about what it said. Leave. My legs were shaking when I walked back to the house. I thought about the previous owner. I thought about every person whose name was on that deed before mine, and what they each decided when they got to this same point. I built this house with my own hands, and I was not going to let anything run me off it. I understood what I had disturbed, and I was not going to clear any more trees. That felt like the fairest thing I could offer. For 7 months, my trail cameras recorded Bigfoot on my property, and nobody believed me. I am still here, and so is it. Dennis and Sandra Callahan and their 2 teenage sons had been camping at Hocking Hills for 3 days. Experienced campers. Dennis told me they'd done that specific campsite 4 times in 6 years. He knew every sound that gorge made at night. When something started circling the tent at 11:43 p.m., he knew immediately it didn't belong. It wasn't footsteps. He said this twice. The way people repeat things they know sound wrong, but need you to understand are accurate. It wasn't footsteps. It was a rhythmic, hollow percussion, a heavy thump, a half-second silence, another thump, coming from ground level, moving in a slow arc around the perimeter of their campsite. Even-paced, deliberate, the beat of something that knew exactly where the edges of their space were and was tracing them. It circled them for 20 minutes. Nobody in the tent spoke. Sandra had her hand on Dennis's arm. The boys, both teenagers who had spent the previous 2 days being aggressively unimpressed by nature, were completely silent. 20 minutes of that rhythmic thump, moving around them in the dark, never accelerating, never breaking pattern. And then the weather radio turned on. They hadn't touched it. It was a hand crank emergency unit sitting on the gear bag at the foot of the tent. It powered on by itself. Dennis reached for it instinctively and stopped with his hand an inch away, because underneath the static, woven into it, almost like the static itself was being shaped, was something that was almost a voice. He told Sandra to listen. She heard it too. Both boys heard it. It took them a moment to isolate it from the noise, and then it was impossible to unisolate. 3 words, repeating, not wood, not wood, not wood. The cadence was human. The spacing between repetitions followed the natural pause pattern of spoken English in a way that randomized static simply does not produce. Something was using the radio's frequency to push 3 words into that campsite, on loop for 47 seconds, before the unit cut to silence. The thumping stopped at the same moment the radio went quiet. I've spent a long time with those 2 words, not wood, something announcing what it is not, declaring what the comparison gets wrong. Whatever moves through Bigfoot's body apparently felt strongly enough about the distinction to repeat it twice a second for 47 seconds into a dead radio in a dark gorge in southern Ohio. My name is Idris Alcott. I ran search and rescue operations in western Appalachia for 19 years, and in that time I learned that mountains keep secrets the way small towns do, quietly, collectively, and for a very long time. This particular mountain has been keeping one since October 2016, and I was there when it started. 2 things happened in the last 60 days that made staying quiet impossible. The first is that someone is writing a book about Levi Dalton's disappearance. I have seen the outline. It is wrong in ways that will hurt his father, and it names conclusions that the evidence does not support and leaves out the evidence that does. Thomas Dalton has been through enough, and he does not deserve to have his son's story told badly by someone who was never on that mountain. The second thing is that 3 weeks ago, a 17-year-old boy went missing on the same mountain, same month, same terrain. I knew before I picked up the phone what they were going to tell me, and I knew what it meant. I have photographs, audio recordings, physical evidence, and a trail camera card that shows exactly what followed Levi Dalton into those woods that day. Every official body I took it to refused to engage with it. But there is a 15-year-old boy who never came home, and now possibly a 17-year-old one, and I am done letting people call this an unsolved disappearance when I know it was something else entirely. I found terrifying evidence on that mountain that proves a Sasquatch took Levi Dalton, and I should have said that 7 years ago. The call came in at 5:17 p.m., a father reporting his 15-year-old son overdue from a solo hunt on the mountain. I had taken that kind of call before. A kid loses track of time, pushes too far in, gets turned around on the way back. 9 times out of 10, they walk out on their own before we even get the team together. I drove to the trailhead with 4 of my people and got there around 6. Thomas Dalton was standing at the tree line in the same clothes he had been wearing all day, still holding his phone, looking at the mountain like he could see something the rest of us could not. I have been to a lot of trailheads with a lot of families, and I can usually read within the first few minutes whether a case is going to be a long night or something worse. I looked at Thomas Dalton standing at that tree line, and I did not get the feeling it was going to be a long night. I got the feeling it was going to be something worse. Thomas Dalton asked me 2 questions while we stood at that trailhead waiting for the rest of the team to arrive. The first was how long we had before dark. The second was whether I thought his son was still on the mountain. I told him we had about 40 minutes of usable light and that yes, I believed Levi was still up there. That second answer was honest when I gave it. By the end of the week, I was not so sure. While we waited, Thomas told me one thing about Levi that I have never been able to put down. He said Levi had been drawing that hunting map for 2 years, adding to it every time they went up together, marking the spots where the deer moved, the places where the light came through the trees right at dawn. He said Levi treated that map like it was something worth keeping. Thomas found out later that Levi had taken it with him that morning without telling anyone. He wanted to add to it on his first solo hunt. That is the detail that has stayed with me longer than any piece of evidence I found on that mountain. We went up that night with flashlights and found his boot print in the mud about 1.5 miles in, then a candy wrapper, then his water bottle sitting upright against a rock at just past the 2-mile mark like he had set it down carefully and meant to come back for it. That bothered me more than if we'd found it smashed. After the water bottle, there was nothing. The trail gave us no additional prints, no dropped gear, and no indication that a 15-year-old boy had kept moving through that terrain at all. We pushed until 2 in the morning and came back down with nothing to show Thomas Dalton, except that his son had made it at least 2 miles in, and then the mountain had stopped talking. It did not make sense for a 15-year-old kid to simply stop leaving signs. There is a specific kind of quiet that a mountain has when something is wrong on it, and that mountain had it from the moment we stepped onto the trail. My team felt it too. Nobody said anything about it that night, but I could tell by the way they were moving that they felt it. Search teams get quiet when they're tired. This was different. I know it because by the second hour, nobody was talking like we were trying to find a missing kid anymore. The tracking team arrived on day 2 with 6 dogs. The handler had 22 years of search and rescue behind her and was the best in the region. I had worked with her before and I trusted her reads completely. The dogs picked up Levi's trail from the trailhead and pushed past where we had stopped the night before, past the water bottle, past the 2-mile mark, further up the mountain than my team had reached. I was maybe 30 yards behind the lead dog when they stopped. All 6 of them stopped at the same point at the same time. 3 of them refused to move forward at all, and the other 3 tried and turned back within a few steps. The handler looked at me, and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything because there was nothing useful to say. In 19 years of search and rescue, I had never seen a full team shut down like that at a single location. There was nothing visible on that trail that should have caused that kind of response in 6 trained animals. She filed it as an extreme fear response, cause undetermined. I signed off on that because at the time, I did not have a better answer. What I did have was the feeling that the dogs knew exactly what was up that mountain and had made a decision that the humans around them were not equipped to make for themselves. That was the moment the search stopped feeling professional and started feeling personal. I had seen fear in search teams before, but never in the dogs. That changed something in me immediately. I left the dogs at the marker and went up alone. I pushed past the 1.8-mile marker alone and worked my way up toward the tree line above it. The terrain got steeper, the trees denser, the light already going flat by the time I reached the upper edge of the tree line. What I found there was not in any search report I filed that day. 4 trees immediately surrounding a small clearing had their bark stripped at a consistent height, roughly 8 feet off the ground. Something had done this deliberately, and whatever did it was tall enough to reach 8 feet without much effort. I stood next to one of the trees and looked up at the stripped section and then looked at the clearing and understood that whatever had done this had been standing there recently. The wood under the stripped bark was still pale and damp. Whatever did it had not been gone long. I photographed everything and went back down. I did not radio it in. I remember looking into that tree line and realizing none of us wanted to find out what was standing up there. On day 3, I started talking to people who lived near the base of that mountain, people who had grown up in the shadow of it and knew it the way you know something you have lived next to your whole life. Every conversation followed the same pattern. I would ask if they had noticed anything unusual on the mountain, and they would go quiet for a moment before answering. It was the quiet of someone deciding how much to say. An old man who had lived on the county road below the mountain. His entire life told me there was a name for what lived up there that his grandfather had used, and his grandfather's father before that. He said everyone in that county knew you did not go up that mountain alone in October. He said it like it has always been true and never needed explaining until someone from outside comes asking. I asked him why October specifically. He looked at me for a moment like he was deciding whether I was worth the full answer. Then he said that October was when it got territorial, and that territorial was putting it mildly. He said his grandfather had a word for what it did to things that wandered into its range that month, and that the word did not translate well into anything I would want to hear. I went back to the search base, and the word territorial stayed with me the rest of that night. He was not the only one who said it. A woman who ran a small farm at the base of the mountain told me her husband went up there one October and came back the same day without his gear and never explained why and never went back. A retired logger who had worked the lower slopes in the 80s told me the crews used to joke about what lived up on the upper ridge until one October when two of them heard something moving through the tree line above camp that was large enough to shake the ground, and nobody joked about it after that. Every person I talked to knew. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but they all knew something was wrong with that mountain. On day 4, one of my team radioed in from the upper mountain. Prints in the dried creek mud 2 miles above the marker. I went up myself, 18 inches long, 5 toes, pressed so deep into the ground that whatever made them was carrying serious weight on each foot. My own boot next to one looked like a child's shoe. The stride length told me whatever made these prints had legs built for covering ground fast on steep terrain. 19 years in these mountains, and nothing had ever left a print like that in front of me. I stood there in that creek bed, staring at those prints, and realizing there was no normal explanation left anymore. Further up from the prints, maybe a quarter mile, we found a cluster of trees with their trunks snapped at about 15 feet off the ground. 4 of them in a rough line, all broken at the same height, the wood at the break still pale and fresh. One of my team members said it looked like storm damage and started to move on. I pulled out my radio and checked the weather records for the past 2 weeks. No storm, not even a significant wind event. I logged it as unexplained and watched my team's faces when I said that word out loud. Nobody argued with me. Nobody even tried. In another case, we would have argued about it for an hour. 19 years of working with these people, and they were not the type to let something go without a reasonable explanation. But standing in front of those trees, not one of them pushed back unexplained. They just looked at the breaks and looked at each other and kept moving. Then something moved in the tree line about 40 feet above us. Something large enough that the brush it displaced sounded like a man walking through a doorway. Every one of my team stopped at the same moment. I looked up at the tree line and thought about the prints in the creek bed, and the bark stripped at 8 feet, and the dogs that would not move past the marker. And I remember looking up into that tree line and realizing nobody on the team wanted to keep climbing. We came back down after that, and I reached the trailhead and knew 2 things. The search was ending, and deep down, I already knew Levi Dalton was never walking back down that mountain. A property owner on the north side of the mountain called the search base while we were still running active searches. He had a trail camera running on October 9th, mounted on a game trail along the upper north face, about 3 miles from where we found the water bottle. He handed me the SD card at his door and told me he did not want to watch it with me. He did not explain why, and I did not ask. I sat at his kitchen table with my laptop and went through 14 hours of footage. Deer moving through at dawn, a turkey around noon, nothing unusual through most of the afternoon. Then at 4:17 p.m., the motion sensor triggered and Levi Dalton walked into the frame, rifle over his shoulder, moving uphill at a steady pace, no sign anything was wrong. He looked like a kid on a good day in the woods. Then I saw what was moving in the tree line behind him. Something massive was moving parallel to him through the trees, tracking him at a consistent distance, staying just outside the clearest range of the frame. Levi never looked back once. That detail has never sat right with me. A kid alone in unfamiliar woods usually checks behind himself eventually. Levi never once did. Why? I went through the footage frame by frame. It was already there in earlier frames, further back, harder to see, moving in the same direction at the same pace. It had been behind him well before the camera caught it. This was not a chance encounter on a trail. I watched that footage 3 times that night. Levi never turned around once. At the time, I thought the trail camera footage was the worst thing I was going to find up there. I was wrong. That point, I already knew I was never going to look at that mountain the same way again. The following morning, I went back up the mountain alone before the rest of the team arrived. I wanted to push further than the official search had gone, and I wanted to do it without having to explain to anyone why. About a mile past the broken trees, I found something wedged inside a split in a tree trunk at about chest height, a folded piece of paper. I pulled it out carefully and opened it, and it was a hand-drawn hunting map. pencil on notebook paper, trails marked, landmarks noted in a 15-year-old's handwriting. Levi's name written in the top corner, the way kids write their name on schoolwork. That map put Levi on the upper mountain at an elevation the official search never reached. He had made it much further up than the water bottle suggested, and whatever happened to him happened up there, in terrain that none of my teams had covered. I stood in the trees holding that map for a while and thought about a kid who had drawn it at his kitchen table the night before he went hunting and had no idea what was waiting for him up there. Neither did we. I logged it privately and told nobody. Reporting it meant sending my team further up that mountain, and I was not going to do that. I went back up alone 2 days before the official search ended. I had Levi's map and 6 weeks of evidence that all pointed to the upper mountain. I could not close this search without going up there one more time. I reached the area past the broken trees and pushed further north along the ridge. About a half-mile past that point, the wood knocks started. 3 of them, deep and resonant, coming from somewhere in the tree line to my left. I had heard wood knocks before in my research. Hearing them alone on the upper mountain where a 15-year-old boy had disappeared was a different experience entirely. Then the infrasound hit, that pressure in the chest with no obvious source, the feeling that something is wrong before your eyes have confirmed anything. My legs wanted to go back down the trail, and I made myself stay. Then it screamed. One sustained vocalization from somewhere close in the tree line that went on long enough that I had time to understand exactly how close it was and exactly how alone I was up there. I have been in dangerous situations in these mountains before. That was the only time I have ever felt like I was being told in a language older than words that I was not going to walk back down if I stayed where I was. I walked back down and did not stop moving until I reached the trailhead. I did not go back up there alone again for 7 years. I had been on dangerous searches before. I had never once felt like the mountain itself was making a decision about me. The official search closed 2 days later. The decision came from above me, and I did not fight it the way I should have. 6 weeks and 200 volunteers and every resource the county could put together, and all we had to show for it was a water bottle and a candy wrapper. On paper, the case had nothing left to justify the cost of continuing. I signed the closing report because I did not know how to explain in writing why I believed we needed to keep going without also explaining what I believed we were looking for, and I was not ready to put that in a document with my name on it. 3 of my team members never came back to search and rescue after that mountain. I had never seen a case stay with people the way this one did. One of them had been with me for 11 years. He did not explain why he was leaving, and I did not ask because I already knew. The others transferred to different counties within the month. I ran into one of them at a hardware store about a year later, and he looked at me for a moment and then looked away and kept walking. That was the last time I saw him. The morning I drove to Thomas Dalton's house, I sat in my truck at the end of his road for a while before I pulled into the driveway. I had told families hard things before. I had never walked into a house knowing what I knew and planning to say what I was about to say. I told myself I was protecting him. I have not entirely believed that in 7 years. I drove to his house the morning after I filed the report. I sat across from Thomas Dalton at his kitchen table and told him we had done everything we could and that the case would remain open and that if anything new came to light, the sheriff's department would follow up. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he asked me one question. He asked me if I knew what had happened to his son. I have thought about my answer to that question every day for 7 years. I told him I did not know. That was the only lie I have ever told a family in 19 years of search and rescue, and I told it because I did not know how to tell a man sitting in his kitchen that his 15-year-old son had been taken by something that every official body I worked with would not acknowledge existed. He nodded and thanked me for coming and walked me to the door. Before I got to my truck, he called after me. He said he knew I was not telling him everything. He said he could live with that as long as I promised him I was not done looking. I told him he had my word. After the official search closed, I started pulling records on every disappearance reported in and around that mountain, going back as far as the county archives went. What I found was a list that nobody in any official capacity had ever connected into a pattern because nobody had ever looked at them all together. I went in expecting maybe 1 or 2 cases with similar characteristics, something I could point to and say there is a pattern worth investigating. What I found instead was 7 of them, going back to 1976, and I sat in that archive for a long time after I found the last one, just looking at the dates lined up on the table in front of me. 7 disappearances over 40 years, all on or within 2 miles of that mountain, all unsolved, all involving people who had gone into those woods alone. And when I laid them out in chronological order, the thing that stopped me cold was not the number of them. It was when they happened. Every single one of them was in October. I spent a long time trying to find an explanation for the October pattern that did not point where everything else was already pointing. Then I found the indigenous oral traditions. I started digging into older stories tied to the mountain, and one thing kept coming up over and over again. October, people around that area had been quietly avoiding those woods that time of year for generations. A 15-year-old boy from a hunting family in western Appalachia walked into that territory alone on October 9, 2016. He had no idea what October meant on that mountain. Nobody had told him because nobody talked about it to outsiders. And the thing that had been using those woods since before anyone in that county was born was waiting. 7 years after the official search closed, I went back up that mountain at night for the first time. I had a thermal camera, an audio recorder, and 7 years of evidence that I needed one more piece to complete. I reached the upper ridge around 9 and set up the thermal camera facing the tree line to the north. The first 2 hours were quiet. Then, at just past 11, the audio recorder picked up wood knocks. 3 of them from somewhere close in the tree line, the same rhythm I had heard 7 years earlier in the same place. I did not move. I want to be honest about what sitting on that ridge at 11 at night actually felt like. 7 years of evidence had not made me comfortable up there. Knowing what I knew made it worse, not better. I was sitting in the dark on the upper ridge of a mountain where a 15-year-old boy had been taken, and something that had been there for generations was standing 60 feet away from me in the tree line, and I was the only person who knew where I was. The infrasound came next, stronger than anything I had felt on that mountain before, strong enough that my hands were shaking before I understood why. And then the thermal camera picked up a heat signature at the edge of the tree line, large, upright, standing completely still about 60 feet away, looking directly at where I was sitting. We stayed like that for a long time. Then it turned and walked back into the trees, and the wood knocks started again from further away, and then stopped. I pulled the thermal footage when I got back down. The heat signature was over 8 feet tall. I remember staring at the screen and realizing I finally had proof something had been standing up there with us all along. I have looked at a lot of thermal footage over the years, and the outline was clear enough to make out the shoulders, the width of the torso, and arms that hung far too low to look human. It stood completely still for over 4 minutes before turning and walking back into the trees. I showed the footage to 3 people afterward, and every one of them went quiet when they saw it. I have that footage. It is the clearest evidence I have ever captured on that mountain, and it has been sitting in a box with everything else for 2 years, waiting for someone to do something with it. 7 years is a long time to be right about something nobody will acknowledge. I retired 2 years ago, not entirely by choice. When you spend the better part of a decade telling anyone who will listen that a Sasquatch took a 15-year-old boy on a mountain in your county, and you have the evidence to back it up, your professional reputation takes a hit that does not fully recover. 2 colleagues I had worked with for over a decade stopped returning my calls. The sheriff who logged Levi's rifle as accidental damage told me at a gas station 3 years after the search that I needed to let it go and that people were starting to talk. I told him people had been dying on that mountain since at least 1976, and that talking was the least of our problems. My ex-wife would tell you this case was a significant factor in our divorce, and she would not be wrong. I kept going back anyway. Every October, I went up that mountain with whatever equipment I could justify buying, and I documented everything I found, and I added it to the box, and I kept looking for the door that would open. After a while, you stop expecting the door to open, and you start doing it, because stopping feels like telling Thomas Dalton that his son did not matter enough to keep going. I was not able to do that. I took the evidence through every official channel I could think of. Every single one of them looked at what I had and chose not to engage with what it meant, not because the evidence was insufficient, because it was inconvenient. I used to think the silence was about skepticism. I do not think that anymore. Every person I took the evidence to understood what they were looking at. The silence was a choice, and the choice was about what acknowledging it would require them to do next. After enough years, you stop mistaking silence for disbelief. The only door that never closed was Thomas Dalton's. He still lives in that house with the same view of the same tree line, and every time I have driven out there over the last 7 years, he has opened the door before I could knock. He knew I was not done. He was not done either. 6 weeks after the official search ended, I got an envelope in the mail at my office. No return address, no note inside, just a single photograph printed on plain paper. It was a trail photograph taken on the upper mountain. I recognized the terrain from my solo walks up there. In the foreground, half buried under leaves and debris, was Levi's rifle. I could see the stock clearly enough to make out the make and model. I had memorized every piece of gear Levi had been carrying when he went up that mountain, because that is what you do on a missing persons case. I never found out who sent it, but whoever took that photograph had been standing close enough to the rifle to see the barrel. They had seen what was done to it, and they had still not gone to the sheriff. That told me something about what people in that county were and were not willing to put their names on. I drove up to the location in the photograph the following morning and found the rifle exactly where the picture showed it. It was about 2 miles above where Levi's map put him, deeper into the upper mountain than I had gone on any of my solo walks. I found it half buried under leaves, exactly where the photograph showed it, stock first, like it had been dropped straight down from above. I picked it up and understood immediately that something was wrong with it. The weight was off. For a second I thought the barrel had snapped, but it hadn't. It had been folded. I turned it over, and that is when I saw what had been done to it. I stood up there on that mountain alone, holding that rifle for a long time. A 15-year-old boy had carried that gun up here for protection. Whatever took him had not been bothered by it in the slightest. The barrel was bent clean in half, not broken, not damaged from a fall. Bent deliberately, folded over like a piece of aluminum foil. Whatever force did that to a steel rifle barrel did it with its hands, and did it without much effort, because there was no other way to produce a bend that clean. I photographed it and brought it straight to local authorities. I laid the rifle on his desk and watched his face while he looked at it. He picked it up, turned it over, set it back down. Then he told me it had probably been damaged in a fall, and that the terrain up there was rough enough to do that kind of thing to equipment. I asked him to show me a fall that bends a steel barrel in half at a clean 90-degree angle without scratching the stock. He did not have an answer for that. He logged it as accidental damage and put it in a box. And that was the last time any official in that county engaged seriously with anything I brought them about Levi Dalton. But I was on that mountain. I found those prints and those broken trees and that rifle with my own hands. I have the trail camera footage and the thermal image and 40 years of October disappearances that nobody has ever officially connected. The evidence does not leave room for another explanation. Levi Dalton was 15 years old when he went up that mountain alone on October 9, 2016, and a Sasquatch took him. The terrifying evidence found on that mountain proves it. Kira Vasquez was a junior at Ohio University who documented everything. She went live on the Strouds Run Trail with 212 viewers watching. For the first 9 minutes and 39 seconds, the video is exactly what it looks like: a college student on a familiar trail. At 9 minutes and 40 seconds, Kira stops walking. The camera still goes with her. 4 seconds of silence. Then, in a voice noticeably quieter than anything before it, she says 3 words: "It's not a bear." Then she runs. The footage during the run is shaky, but at the 6-second mark, the camera swings left for just over 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, in the gap between 2 mature oak trees at the edge of the trail, something is visible. I've paused on that frame more times than I can count. The 2 oaks are approximately 14 inches apart at that gap. I confirmed it by visiting the trail myself. 14 inches is not a passage. It's a gap you turn sideways to squeeze through if you're slender. What moves through it in Kira's footage is not slender. It is massive and dark, with a shoulder width the shaky frame still cannot fully contain. It did not push the trees apart. Both oaks are visible before and after the shape crosses. Neither trunk moves. Something wider than the gap passed through without touching either tree. Kira withdrew from Ohio University 11 days later. Through a mutual contact, I reached her. She confirmed she'd seen it from roughly 40 feet before she ran, standing completely still between the trees, facing her direction. She said the stillness was the worst part. Not movement, not aggression, just absolute stillness. My kids are Della, who was 9, and Owen, who was 6. We had moved to the property 8 months earlier after I got a divorce. A 4-bedroom on 2 acres in a rural county about 90 minutes from the nearest city, backing up to Forest Service land that stretched unbroken for miles. There was a lot of space for 3 people. That was the point. The price was right, because the nearest neighbor was a quarter mile up the road and most buyers wanted to be closer to things. We did not know what was already back there in the trees. The kids found the edge of the property within their first week. There was a fence line, post and wire, old sagging in sections, and beyond it, the Forest Service land started. And I had told them clearly, fence is the line. You don't cross the fence. They nodded the way 9- and 6-year-olds nod when they have already decided what they're going to do. They crossed the fence. I didn't find out for 3 weeks. I found out because Della came home with a handful of plants she wanted to identify. Specific plants, named by location, described with a precision that a 9-year-old does not come up with on her own. She said her friend had shown her where they grew. I said, "What friend?" She said, "The big one in the woods." I said, "How big?" She looked at me with the specific patience children reserve for adults who are missing something obvious. She held her hand up as high as she could reach. Then she pointed at the ceiling. Then she shrugged, as if the ceiling wasn't high enough to finish the point. I told her not to go into the woods alone. I called it a safety talk. What it actually was the first moment I felt something I couldn't name, yet moved through my chest. Not quite fear, not quite anything I had a word for. I went out that evening and walked the fence line. I found a section on the northeast corner where something had pressed against the wire repeatedly enough to bow it outward. Not broken, not forced, just leaned on. At a height that didn't match my kids. At a height that didn't match much of anything I could think of standing there in the evening light looking at the bent wire with the forest going dark behind it. I straightened the wire and went back inside and told myself it was deer. It was not deer. I need to give you the shape of the next 3 weeks before I tell you what I saw, because the shape of those weeks is what made what I saw impossible to dismiss or explain away or file somewhere reasonable. The kids were different, not in a way that scared me. That's important. They were not withdrawn or secretive or showing any signs I'd been trained to watch for. They were better, more settled. Owen had been having nightmares since the move, and they stopped. Della had been quiet in the way of a kid holding something too heavy for her age, and she started talking again. At dinner, in the car, the running commentary of a child who has remembered that the world is interesting. I noticed, and I didn't question it hard enough. I was exhausted and barely keeping everything moving, and my kids were doing better. I did not look hard enough at why. They told me things in the way kids tell you things. Sideways, embedded in other conversations, offered and then moved past before you can respond. Owen told me at breakfast one morning that their friend didn't talk the way we talk, but that Della was learning. He said it the way you'd say someone was learning French. Informational. Then he asked if we had any more of the orange juice. Della told me their friend liked the apples from the tree at the property line. She told me it didn't like loud sounds. She told me it was teaching her something about where the creek went, information she described with a geographic specificity I couldn't account for. I asked how she knew. She said her friend showed her. Walked her through it. I asked, "Walked you where?" She named locations half a mile into Forest Service land that she had no business being in and had definitely accessed through the fence I had told her not to cross. I should have gone to the tree line that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed and pulled up every Bigfoot account I could find in the Pacific Northwest and read until 2 in the morning. Then I closed the laptop and sat in the dark and told myself I was not entertaining the idea. I was very much entertaining the idea. I set up a camera, trail camera, the same model I used to monitor deer on client properties. Mounted it at the northeast corner of the fence line. I checked it 3 mornings in a row and found deer, a raccoon, a porcupine, and nothing else. On the 4th morning, the camera was on the ground, not knocked over, placed down, carefully, face up. The mount was still on the post. The camera had been detached and set on the ground with deliberateness. Memory card still in it. The last image before the lens went skyward was a frame of darkness and a shape at the edge of the frame that I have looked at many times since and cannot describe with precision. Large, upright, close. That was the morning I stopped telling myself it was deer. I bought 2 more cameras and mounted all 3 that evening higher on the posts, secured with zip ties. The next morning, all 3 were on the ground, placed, carefully, face up. The footage showed the same shape at the frame's edge, moving without urgency, then the image tilting as the camera was removed from its mount. Whatever it was had hands. Whatever it was knew what a camera was. I called in sick to work for the first time in 6 years. sat in my truck at the end of the driveway thinking about the fact that something with the dexterity to remove a zip-tied camera mount had been at my fence line at least 4 times in 8 days, and my kids had been crossing that fence line every afternoon. Then I went inside and looked at Owen's drawings. He drew constantly. I had not looked closely in weeks. There were maybe 30 drawings tacked above his desk. Most were what you'd expect: houses, cars, his sister, me. But interspersed with those, appearing more and more frequently the further right along the wall I looked, were drawings of something else. A figure, large. Owen drew it relative to the trees, and the trees only came to its shoulders. Dense, layered marks for fur or hair. Always the same posture, standing at the edge of the trees, at the fence, one hand raised, waving. Owen had been drawing a Bigfoot waving at him for at least 6 weeks, and I had not noticed. I sat on the edge of his bed for a long time. Then I knocked on Della's door. She was 11 days from her 10th birthday. Smart in the way that made her teachers call me every September, and perceptive in the way that made those same teachers look slightly uncomfortable. She knew immediately that something had shifted. She said, "You found the cameras?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I told it you were going to put cameras up. I told it not to break them. I said, just move them." I sat down on her desk chair and said, "Della, tell me everything." She did. It had been 17 days. She had crossed the fence looking for the creek, which she had heard from the property but not yet found. She found the creek. She also found something sitting beside it. Large, covered in dark reddish-brown fur, sitting on a rock at the creek's edge the way a person sits, not crouching, not on all fours, watching the water. It heard her before she saw it. It turned its head before she made a sound, and it looked at her. I asked, "Were you scared?" She said she was for about 3 seconds. Then it held its hand out, not toward her, just open, resting on the rock beside it, and something about that stopped the scared. She went back the next day, and the day after that. She brought Owen on the 4th day. I asked why she hadn't told me. She said, "Because you would have stopped it." She was right, and I was not fully certain, sitting on her desk chair, that stopping it would have been the correct decision. I told her I needed to see it myself. She said, "I know. It knows too." We went out the next afternoon. Me, Della, Owen, through the fence at the northeast corner, down the slope toward the creek. Della led with a confidence in the terrain she had not had 8 months ago. Owen held my hand, not frightened, just contained. The excitement of a kid who knows something good is coming. The creek was about 400 meters from the fence, 30 feet wide, moving fast with spring runoff, old growth firs on both sides thick enough to cut the Issei afternoon light. It was there, on the far bank, standing. I am 6'1". I have framed enough buildings to know heights instinctively. What was standing on the far bank was between 8 and 9 feet. The shoulders, not just the height, the shoulders, were wide in a way I could not fit into any human or animal frame I had. Wide the way load-bearing things are wide. It looked at me with a directed, specific attention. Not aggression, not fear. Something I can only call evaluation. The warm kind, the kind that contains intelligence behind it. Della said quietly, "It's okay, Dad." Owen let go of my hand and took 3 steps toward the bank. I grabbed for him. Della caught my arm. She shook her head. She said, "Watch." Owen raised one hand. The same gesture from the drawings. From the far bank, a hand went up. The hand alone was the size of Owen's upper body. Raised slowly, held open, then lowered. Owen grinned like he'd been waiting weeks to show me exactly this. I stood at that creek bank for 40 minutes. I watched my kids interact with a Bigfoot the way children interact with something they fully trust, easily, without performance. Della moved to the bank and made sounds I had never heard her make, structured tones she produced with visible concentration. Something came back from the far bank. Same register, different pattern, back and forth. She was communicating with it. My daughter was standing at a creek in the Pacific Northwest having a conversation with a Bigfoot, and I was standing 10 feet behind her, trying to remember how to breathe. I asked her afterward what they were saying. She said it wasn't like translating, more like knowing, direction, intention, the way you read an expression but through sound instead of face. She said it had been asking about me for days. She had told it I was having a hard time. It told her that hard times are what the trees do in winter, that being bare and cold isn't the same as being dead. My 9-year-old daughter delivered that to me, standing beside a creek in the dark firs, and I stood there with it and did not say anything for a long time. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and ran the inventory. 8 or 9 feet, shoulders like load-bearing structure, a hand raised in response to my 6-year-old's hand, eye contact that contained something I could only call intelligence. My daughter producing sounds she did not know 3 weeks ago and being answered in kind. I am a practical person. I solve problems for a living. Materials, load, weather, code. I am not someone who lies in the dark and circles something without a solution path. I lay in the dark for 4 hours. What kept coming back was not the size, it was the hand. Owen's hand going up and the hand on the far bank going up in return. Slow, deliberate, the same shape returned. Whatever was on that bank had watched my son long enough to know that was his greeting, had learned it, had decided to use it back. That is not instinct. That is not territorial behavior. That is something paying close attention to a 6-year-old boy and choosing to respond to him on his terms. I did not know if that should make me feel better or worse. It made me feel both in equal measure at 2 in the morning, alone in a house that backed up to 40 miles of forest I now understood differently than I had the day before. I decided we would not go back. I told Della the next morning. She listened the way she listened when she had already prepared her counter-argument. She said it hadn't hurt them. She said it had been nothing but careful. She said I was making a decision based on fear, and that wasn't fair. She was 9 years old and she was right, and I still said no. I want to be honest about what those 4 days looked like because they matter for understanding what came after. The first day was manageable. I kept the kids in, gave them screens and snacks and the kind of guilt-driven parenting that happens when you know you're overriding something your child cares about and you don't have a clean argument for it. Della was cold with me in the efficient way she had when she'd registered a decision as unjust and was cataloging it for future reference. Owen was quieter than usual, but not distressed. The second day, I walked the fence line alone at dusk. I told myself I was checking the perimeter. What I was actually doing was standing at the bowed section of wire and looking into the trees and trying to decide what I was more afraid of, what was in there, or what my kids were becoming in relation to it. I didn't have an answer. I went back inside. The third day, I called my sister, who is the person I call when I am not sure I am thinking clearly. I did not tell her about the Bigfoot. I told her the kids had been going into the woods beyond the fence line, and I wasn't comfortable with it, and I had told them to stop, and now Owen wasn't sleeping. She said, kids need outside. She said, you're probably overcorrecting because of the divorce. She said, let them have something that's theirs. She did not know what she was giving advice about. I did not tell her. I sat on the phone for another 10 minutes talking about other things, and then I hung up and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the tree line. That lasted 4 days. Owen stopped sleeping. Not nightmares, worse. He would just sit up in bed and look at the window, alert and quiet, the way he'd been when I told him his mother and I were splitting. I found him at 2 in the morning, sitting at the back door, looking at the tree line, not upset, just waiting. I asked what he was waiting for. He said, it comes to the fence at night sometimes, to check. I stood in my kitchen at 2 in the morning and stared at my 6-year-old son, and something cold moved through me that I am still not fully able to describe. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it, the total absence of fear in his voice. The same way he'd say the mail comes in the afternoon or the sun sets over there. It had been coming to the fence at night. It had been 10 meters from my sleeping children, and my son found this unremarkable. I took them back to the creek the next afternoon, not because I had changed my mind, because I understood by then that the decision had already been made without me, and that my job was to be there when it was made. The second visit was different from the first. We came down the slope to the bank, and it was already on our side. Not the far bank, our side. Standing in the trees about 50 feet upstream, at the edge of the fir line, in a posture I had not seen before. Upright but tense, the shoulders set differently, the head angled toward the slope above us rather than toward me or the kids. Della stopped walking. I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "Something's coming." I heard it before I saw it. A different set of sounds from higher on the slope. Not wood knocking, not anything structured, more like the forest rearranging itself. Branches, weight on ground, plural, more than one something moving down through the trees toward the creek from the northeast. The one at the tree line made a sound I had not heard it make before. Short, percussive, one impact, and then silence, and whatever was on the slope stopped. I do not know how long we stood there. long enough that my arms had gone to my kids without me deciding to move them, one hand on each of them, pulling them close without looking down. Long enough for the creak sound to come back in my awareness. Long enough for me to understand that I had no plan, no weapon, no training, no framework for what I would do if something came through that tree line. I am a contractor. I build things. I have never been in a situation where my body understood the danger before my mind did, and I had nothing to offer either of them. The sounds on the slope shifted, not retreating yet, waiting. Whatever was up there was receiving information and deciding what to do with it. The one at our tree line made the sound again. Same register, different length. And the slope sounds changed, slower, then stopping, then the unmistakable crashing retreat of something large moving fast back up through the brush away from us. Whatever had been coming down that slope was gone in about 15 seconds. The one at the tree line turned its head and looked at us. Della said very quietly, "It told them to go." I asked what they were. She said she didn't know. She said it felt different from it, older. She said the word it used for them didn't translate. I want to sit with that for a moment because I think it is the most important thing my daughter has ever said to me, even though she was 9 and said it like she was reporting the weather. The word it used for them didn't translate. There is a something in those trees that my daughter can partially communicate with, and that something used a word for the others, the ones on the slope, that did not have an equivalent in any language Della had access to, which means the others are sufficiently different from the one we knew that there was no common term, which means the categories out there in that forest do not map onto anything I have a word for. I got my kids home in under 10 minutes. I did not look back at the tree line. I got them through the fence and across the property and inside the house, and I locked the back door, and I stood in the kitchen with my heart running at a rate I hadn't felt since I was in a car accident at 24. Della sat down at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "It protected us. I know that is what happened. Something came down that slope, and it was not the one we knew, and the one we knew sent it back. That is the fact of it. But here is the other fact. There are more of them. The one we knew about was the one that left granite pieces and lowered itself to the ground, so Della didn't have to look up so far. We knew that one. We had built something with that one over weeks of creek visits and structured sound and a 6-year-old's open hand. We did not know what else was in the corridor. We still don't. On the 6th visit, the one we knew brought something, left it at the creek bank before we arrived. A piece of granite threaded with a wide vein of white quartz, smooth from years in the water, too specific to be accidental. Owen picked it up and said, "It's for us." He still has it on his windowsill. I look at it differently now than I did before the slope. We went back 3 more times after that. Each visit followed roughly the same shape. It was there, on the bank or on our side, quiet and attentive. Della moved closer than I was comfortable with, and I let her, because I had learned by then that my comfort was not the relevant variable. Owen stood at the bank and held his hand up, and the hand on the far bank went up in return, and it was the closest thing to a ritual I had ever witnessed that I did not invent or understand. On the 8th visit, it was already across when we arrived, not at the tree line, closer, maybe 30 feet, sitting against the base of a fir, the way it had sat at the creek that first day Della found it. Owen walked toward it without hesitation. He sat down on the ground about 10 feet away, and they were there for 20 minutes, and I stood behind them and did not move, and watched my 6-year-old son sit in silence with a Bigfoot in the forest behind my house. I did not have a name for what I was feeling. I still don't. What I do know is that on every walk back, I checked the upper slope. The sounds from the 2nd visit were never repeated, but the checking became involuntary, the new habit of a man who understood that the forest had layers, and that the one he had been introduced to was not the deepest one. The 10th visit was the last. We went at our usual time, mid-afternoon. The creek was loud with late spring runoff. The firs threw long shadows. It was not there. We waited an hour. Della made the sounds at the bank and got nothing back. Owen sat on a rock with the particular stillness he had developed over the weeks, and I watched him and thought about the 2 in the morning visits to the back door and the thing he found unremarkable. Della said, "It's gone, not from the creek. Gone, gone." I heard it in her voice. We walked back in the late afternoon. Owen held my jacket. Della's shoulders carried something she didn't have words for yet. That night at dinner, nobody talked much. Owen got the granite piece and put it in the middle of the table, and we all looked at it. Then he said, "It'll come back." I asked how he knew. He said, "Because we're here." He said it with total certainty. The same certainty he had standing at the back door at 2 in the morning watching the tree line. I did not find that comforting. I have been back to the creek 8 times since the last visit. Tracks every time, large, fresh, the stride I can't match. It is in the corridor. It has not come to the fence the way it was coming, but it is there. And twice, once on the 3rd visit, once on the 7th, I heard the other sounds. Not from the creek, from further up the slope, behind the old growth, moving parallel to my route, and staying back just enough to stay out of sight. Not the one I know. I know that sound now, its weight and its register, and the particular way it moves through the firs with a deliberateness that has its own signature. This was not that. This was faster, less careful, moving with the kind of indifference to noise that suggests it was not trying to be anything other than what it was. I don't know if it was following me or if I was simply moving through territory it was already occupying. I don't know if that distinction matters. I put one camera back at the fence. 3rd morning, it was on the ground. Same placement, face up, lens at the sky. I left it where it was. 3 days later, it was back on the post, adjusted slightly, angled toward the Forest Service land. I am not sure anymore whether that is reassurance or instruction. My kids know it's still out there. Owen goes to the fence line some evenings and stands there in the way he learned from watching it be still. Some nights I look out the kitchen window and he's there in the near dark, very quiet, looking at the trees. Last week I went out to bring him in and he held up one finger without turning around. Wait. I waited. The tree line was dark. The firs were black against the last of the light. I stood there for 30 seconds, 40, and I heard nothing except the wind in the upper branches and the far sound of the creek. Then Owen dropped his hand and turned around and came inside. I asked what he had heard. He said, "Nothing." Then he said, "Not yet." He said it with a 6-year-old's complete confidence, walking past me into the kitchen, and I stood at the fence line alone in the falling dark, and I looked at the trees and I thought about the slope. The word it used for them didn't translate. I have been standing at that fence line 3-4 times a week since, not because I expect to see the one we know, because I am trying to do what Owen does: stand still, stay open. Let the information come at whatever rate it comes. Last Tuesday I heard something from the slope I could not identify. Not the creek, not the wind, not any animal sound I have cataloged in the 8 months I have lived here. Structured, brief, in a register lower than anything I have heard the one we know produce. It did not repeat. I stood there for 20 minutes in the dark. Nothing else came. But I have not told the kids what I heard, because I do not know what it means yet. And I am their father, and some information needs to stay with the person who can do something about it. The problem is, I am not sure what that something is. Della asked me last night at dinner whether I thought it would come back. I said I thought it was still in the corridor. She said, "That's not what I asked." She was right. That was not what she asked. I told her I didn't know. She nodded like she had expected that answer and was already working around it. I am 38 years old. I have built things with my hands my whole life. I know how structures work, what makes something hold, what to do when the ground shifts underneath you. The ground has shifted. I do not know what is in those trees. Not all of it, not the full depth of it. I know one layer. I do not know how many layers there are. And somewhere on that slope, in a register I am only beginning to be able to hear, something is using a word my daughter cannot translate. I think about that every night. I think about it at 2 in the morning when the house is quiet and Owen is asleep and the back of my property is dark and still. I check the lock on the back door, and then I stand at the kitchen window and I look at the tree line, and I wonder what is looking back. Todd Schaffer has been a game warden in southeastern Ohio for 19 years. The Wednesday morning call from a farmer on the eastern edge of Wayne National Forest was about to add something to his inventory that he will carry for the rest of his life. 8 dead deer were arranged in a clearing approximately 200 yards inside the tree line from the farm's eastern fence. Positioned in a rough circle, each carcass facing outward from the center. There was no blood, not a trace, no pooling beneath the bodies, no spatter on the surrounding vegetation, no staining on the ground. 8 deer laid in a deliberate pattern with no external wounds and no blood, but her neck was broken. All 8 snapped at the second cervical vertebra with a consistency that the state wildlife veterinarian who later examined the carcasses described as extraordinary. Whatever broke those necks did so with a precision that, in 22 years of wildlife pathology, she had never encountered from an animal attack. She told Todd it looked mechanically like a procedure. Not violence, not predation, procedure. Then Todd found the shelter, built at the northern edge of the clearing, set back into the tree line just far enough that he'd missed it on his first 2 passes. A dome structure roughly 6 feet high and 8 feet across, constructed from living saplings that had been bent and woven together while still rooted in the ground. The weaving stopped him. Every junction where 2 saplings crossed was secured in a knot that Todd photographed and later showed to a botanist at Ohio State, who identified the pattern as nothing in any indigenous or traditional construction method she could reference. The knots weren't just functional, they were symmetrical, each one a mirror of the last, tied with a consistency that implied either long practice or a cognitive relationship with structure that nobody has ever formally attributed to Bigfoot. In the center of the shelter, on bare ground cleared down to the soil, river stones had been arranged in a spiral, smooth, palm-sized stones with no business being 200 yards inside a forest with no creek nearby. Todd counted 31. Photographed from above, the spiral pointed magnetic north, aimed, when I later overlaid it on a topographic map, directly at a ridge system 40 miles away. A ridge that sits directly above the Nelson Kennedy ledges. Gerald Ashworth has been deaf since birth. He has been hunting Shawnee State Forest since he was 12. He told me all of this through an interpreter. He'd been in the blind since 5 a.m. At 7:28, he felt the vibration through the platform under his boots, a slow, rhythmic ground compression that his feet told him was heavy, bipedal, and closer than anything that weight had any right to be without him having registered it approaching. He turned. Something was standing 30 feet away in the creek bottom, facing him directly, 7 feet tall. Broad through the chest and shoulders, narrower at the hip, covered in dark reddish-brown hair that caught the early light differently than fur, differently than hair, differently than anything Gerald had a word for. The face, and his interpreter paused here when Gerald did, was not an animal's face. That was the phrase he used and came back to twice. Then Bigfoot raised its hands. Gerald Ashworth has been fluent in American Sign Language his entire life. His hands are his first language and his deepest literacy. When Bigfoot lifted both hands and began to move them, Gerald's brain did what it does every day. It read. The signs weren't standard ASL, the hand shapes approximate, the movements larger and rougher than conventional signing, grammar stripped to bare meaning, the way a child signs before they learn syntax. But the intent was legible. 3 concepts, in sequence, unmistakable to a man who has spent half a century reading hands. Go, bad night, many come. Gerald came down from that blind faster than he'd moved in 20 years. He drove to the Scioto County Sheriff's substation and reported what he'd seen. The deputy logged it. The sheriff apparently found it funny enough to share with the morning shift. Gerald asked the deputy to walk out to the parking lot. The scratches were on the tailgate of Gerald's truck, parked at the Shawnee trailhead since 5 a.m. 3 parallel lines, each 18 inches long, running horizontally across the steel. Not surface scratches. The metal had been displaced inward rather than scraped away. Gerald's truck is a late model half-ton with 16-gauge steel. The deputy pressed his thumb into the nearest groove and said nothing. Quarter-inch displacement. At a trailhead where Bigfoot had never physically been. Whatever signed a warning in that creek bottom had also signed his truck from miles away. Many come. Thursday morning. 5 sightings already in 4 days. Pete Garrison and his brother-in-law Carl Doost had been anchored in the northern channel since before first light when the tree line moved. That's how Pete described it first. Not figures emerging from the forest, but the tree line itself shifting. Then they were visible. Pete put his hand on Carl's arm without a word. Carl had already seen them. 5 Bigfoot walked out of the tree line and into Burr Oak Lake. 3 adults and 2 juveniles moving in a loose group with the same unhurried, purposeful stride that every witness this week had described in some form. Not cautious, not reactive, not behaving like creatures that expected to be observed or cared about being observed. The 2 juveniles were flanked by adults on both sides. The largest adult leading from the front, Pete estimated at 10 feet tall. They didn't swim. That's the detail Carl kept returning to when I spoke with him separately, and that Pete had already told me, and that both men described in identical terms without having compared notes before my calls. They did not swim. The adults waded in to chest depth and then continued walking as the water rose over their heads, and they did not resurface. The juveniles went under at shoulder depth. The surface of the lake closed over the last of them and went still. No bubbles, no displacement wake, no sign that 5 massive creatures had just submerged into a reservoir with a maximum depth in that channel of 60 feet. Pete told me they sat in that boat for a long time without speaking. What neither of them knew was that a state geological survey vessel had been working Burr Oak that same morning. Routine lakebed sonar mapping. When the crew's equipment registered something the team lead described as the most anomalous reading of his 12-year career, they stopped. The sonar return showed a structure beneath the sediment, rectangular, 60 feet in length, with straight edges and right angles that sediment does not produce and erosion does not carve. The team lead told me the readout was, in his exact words, consistent with a collapsed structure of artificial origin. They weren't walking into a lake. They were walking into a door. Dana Reeves is a second-year geology graduate student at Kent State focusing on subsurface magnetic anomalies. She reads landscapes the way other people read text. She'd spent the week watching the Ohio reports accumulate. By Thursday night, after the game warden spiral and the sonar anomalies started circulating, she pulled up a county map and plotted all 7 locations. Every sighting formed a perfect circle. 7 points, 7 counties, 5 days. When Dana drew the boundary, the center landed on the Nelson Kennedy ledges with a precision that she said made her physically cold when she saw it. The ledges sit on one of the highest concentrations of magnetite rock in northeastern Ohio. She drove there alone. At night, she told me she knew it was the wrong decision when she made it. She went anyway. She had a portable ground-penetrating radar unit in her trunk and a hypothesis that was going to eat her alive until she either proved or disproved it. She arrived at 11:19 p.m. and walked in with her radar. She didn't see Bigfoot. She saw the space where Bigfoot should have been, a heat shimmer. The same visual distortion Marcus Tilley had described from Route 56 on Monday, that rippling displacement of air that looks like midsummer heat off hot pavement. But this was not a brief crossing on a road. This was a vertical column of it, stationary, 10 feet tall, at the center of the main ledge formation. Stable enough that Dana walked a full circle around it. The radar was not detecting a creature, it was detecting a seam, a vertical fracture in the bedrock running straight down from the surface, narrow at the top and opening at roughly 200 feet into a lateral cavity that the radar's depth return put at stadium scale. The ceiling of that cavern, where the radar could resolve it, was 400 feet below where Dana was standing, and moving through that cavern, registering on the ground-penetrating radar as the same heat shimmer displacement signature that had appeared on every piece of recording equipment touched by this week's events, were shapes, dozens of them, some at the size the adult witnesses had described above ground, some smaller, some registering at dimensions that the radar's scale bar suggested were larger than anything reported all week, all of them moving in the same direction. Slowly, without urgency, in what the readout's density suggested was an organized group, not moving toward the surface, assembling. James Okafor is a wildlife photographer. He'd been in Hocking Hills all week on a separate assignment, migratory owl documentation, sleeping in a converted cargo van he uses as a mobile base, parked off a service road on the southern edge of the park. He had not been following the Bigfoot reports. He did not know about any of the preceding 8 encounters when he woke up at 2:47 in the morning to what he first thought was the wind. The van was rocking gently, a slow, rhythmic side-to-side sway that he described as the motion of a boat on a calm lake. He lay still for a moment, listening. No wind, no sound from outside that would explain it. Then he heard the breathing, right at the van's side wall, close enough that he could hear the depth of it. Long, slow, deliberate respirations at the wall panel beside his head, 12 inches from his face. Not the rapid breath of something excited or alarmed, the deep, controlled breathing of something that was deliberately slowing itself down, something managing its own state. James did not move. The breathing continued for a long time. He stopped counting after 3 minutes. A second set of respirations joined from the front of the van, different cadence, slightly faster. A third at the rear doors, with the irregular spacing of something younger, breath control not yet settled. 3 of them, circling his van at 2:47 in the morning, not trying to get in, not making threatening contact, just breathing against the walls of the space he was inside. He reached for his camera, mounted on a dash bracket with a wide-angle lens pointed through the windshield, and pressed record without lifting it, without moving anything above the dashboard sill. What the camera captured over the next 11 minutes is the clearest sustained footage of Bigfoot ever recorded, not shaky trail footage, not a grainy security frame. 11 minutes of a clearing in pale ambient light, 3 figures visible for most of it. 2 adults and what James believes is a juvenile, given the proportional difference and the way the smallest figure stayed close to the larger adult. They weren't foraging. They weren't marked. They were looking at the van. All 3 of them, at various points, stood and looked at the windows, at the windshield, at the side where James lay 3 inches from the wall. At the 11-minute mark, the smallest figure moved to the driver's side window and raised one hand to the glass. Not a strike, not a test of the surface. It placed its palm flat against the window with a deliberateness that James described to me as gentle. The specific, careful gentleness of something that understood the glass was a boundary and was choosing not to break it. It held that palm against the window for 41 seconds. At the height of the palm print, there was condensation, the misted impression of a hand left by the temperature differential between the surface and whatever pressed against it. James photographed it from inside before it faded. The palm print, measured against the window frame he later documented for scale, was 11 inches across. The hardest part, James told me, wasn't the fear. It was what the largest one did before it left. It turned back just once at the tree line, not at the van, at the specific window where the hand had been placed. The way you look at a door you've just knocked on when you're not sure anyone is home. James Okafor's footage was released 4 days after the encounter. Within 72 hours, it had been viewed 11 million times. Within 96 hours, federal wildlife officials had contacted him directly. He was asked not to discuss the specifics of those conversations. The footage is still online. Here is what 9 encounters in 72 hours looks like when you lay them flat. Monday, a thermal event on a highway, a burn mark on a dog, a webbed track at a sealed tunnel. By Tuesday, 200 people had watched something pass through a 14-inch gap on live video, and a family lay in a tent listening to a dead radio tell them what Bigfoot is not made of. By Wednesday, a game warden photographed surgical neck fractures and symmetric knots, with 31 river stones pointing 40 miles north. By Thursday, a deaf hunter received a signed warning in a creek bed. By Friday morning, a geology student stood above a 400-foot cavern full of moving shapes, and 2 fishermen watched a family of 5 walk into 60 feet of reservoir water above an artificial structure on the lake bed. And by Saturday morning, something had pressed a palm to a photographer's window and waited 41 seconds for a response. Go, bad night, many come. That's what Gerald Ashworth was told Thursday morning, stripped down to what could cross the language gap. Here is what I think many mean, not a threat. A description of something already in motion, a migration, a gathering, a movement through the underground corridor system that the sonar and the radar had just revealed beneath southeast Ohio. The heat shimmer signature that appeared on Marcus Tilley's dash cam, on Dana's radar, at the ledges, and on James Okafor's van. That's not a side effect. That's what happens when something built differently than we moves through a world. Calibrated for us, not wood. 47 seconds of it through a dead radio. Whatever moves through Bigfoot the way blood moves through us is not biological material as we use that term. The thermal signature, the 1/4-inch displacement in steel, the 14-inch gap that nothing wide enough to fill it touched. Those are not the behaviors of flesh and bone. The circle Dana plotted wasn't a hunting range. It was the surface boundary of a transit system operating beneath southeastern Ohio. The sightings weren't random. They were incidental, moments where the system brushed the world above it and left a mark. They weren't in Ohio because Ohio has what they need. They were passing through Ohio because Ohio is above where they were going. And on Saturday morning, one of them stopped and placed a palm on a window and waited 41 seconds to see if anyone inside was paying attention. The question 9 sightings in 72 hours left me with is not whether Bigfoot is real. That question is settled. The question is what paying attention means to something that has been moving through the bedrock beneath us since long before we were here to notice. A palm on a window, 41 seconds. What was it waiting to feel?